I am indeed going to be talking about, partly, about my book, What's Wrong with the One-State Agenda, Why Ending the Occupation and Peace with Israel is Still the Palestinian National Goal. It was published by the American Task Force on Palestine. We sell hard copies like this on our website for $10, but we want everyone to read it, so we've made it available for free download. You can read it online in HTML, you can read it in ebook format, and you can download a PDF and print it out completely for free. So really not trying to make money off of this venture. We are really just trying to put out this important critique, I think, of a new development that's been gaining steam in Palestinian and pro-Palestinian advocacy in mainly in the diaspora, mainly in college campuses in the UK and the US. This notion of the idea that the Palestinian national strategy should abandon the long-standing goal of seeking an end to the occupation and the creation of an independent Palestinian state to live alongside Israel in favor of a much more far-reaching, completely different agenda of replacing the state of Israel and the occupation with a single, unified, democratic state for all the people who live in it and the refugees, and all the Palestinian refugees as well, has really not been challenged until now from a pro-Palestinian point of view, from someone with credibility on this issue and who's worked against the occupation for couple decades here in my case. The main critics of this agenda have been people on the Israeli right. The most noteworthy example of that is there are two book-length studies that are critical of this idea. One is by me, and the other is, which preceded it by a few months only, is by Benny Morris, the Israeli historian. And that book is a racist tract. His explanation really for why he opposes the idea of a single state is essentially that Palestinians are incorrigible people. You can't live with them. They'll never accept the existence of Israel. And they're just not fit to be dealt with. You can't make any kind of deal with them. It's a racist track, and this type of attack from he may not belong to the Israeli right as such, but from a racist version of Zionism is helpful, I think, to one-state Palestinian and Arab one-state activists and advocates. It doesn't make them. It doesn't raise any questions about their agenda. It doesn't really function as a critique at all, because it's coming from a space that actually reinforces the perceptions and opinions. So I thought it was timely and important to let anyone who's interested know that there are very serious problems with this line of argumentation. And that it is, in my view, a strategic blunder for Palestinians and friends of Palestine to move in this direction. And I wanted to explain why, and so I wrote this book, and I want to tell you about it. Now, the idea of a single binational state in all of mandatory Palestine, historical Palestine, is, of course, not a new idea. But in its deep history, it was really a Jewish idea and not a Palestinian or pro-Palestinian idea. It emerged in the 30s and into the 40s in the Jewish settler community in Palestine. People like Martin Buber and others who said, look, maybe the point of Zionism isn't or shouldn't be the creation of a specifically Jewish state in Palestine or in part of Palestine. Maybe it should be some kind of binational entity with the Palestinians. And it certainly had a constituency at the time. But I think for a number of factors, most notably the increasing intensity of communal strife and sectarian conflict in mandatory Palestine between Jews and Arabs, and also the increasing international pressure for the creation of a Jewish state in part of Palestine kind of killed this on the vine. It really saw by the end of the Second World War, 45, 46, it was sort of irrelevant discourse among the proto-Israelis, the Jewish people of the mandatory Palestine era. And it's always been, there have always been a group of Israeli Jews and other Jews who have believed in this, but it hasn't been a part of the Israeli political scene or a significant discourse for a long time until recently. When the Palestinian national movement reconstituted itself after the Nakba, after the founding of the Israeli state and the ethnic cleansing of the most of the Palestinians from what became Israel, the Palestinian national movement, when it regrouped, as I say, in '64, and as is reflected in the both versions of the PLO charter, the '64 version and the '68 version, certainly talked in terms of a single democratic state. But those documents are also very clear that this is going to be an Arab state with a Jewish minority or a Jewish presence, but ethnically an Arab state. This is very clear in both documents. There's no other way to read them. So the idea that the present one-state agenda is some sort of recovery of the traditional PLO mission is, I think, wrong. I think except insofar as perhaps there is let's say, more of an ethnic tinge to this argument than its proponents will ever admit, or at least admit publicly. What happened, of course, is that the PLO amended that strategy. It became very clear that this strategy of eliminating Israel, replacing it with an Arab-dominated single state through armed struggle was just not going to work. And throughout the 70s, the Palestinian national movement evolved in the direction of accepting a two-state solution and shifting to the goal of seeking independence in the occupied territories. And this was formalized in the late 80s through a series of measures. And then the diplomatic process sort of fully engaged in the Oslo process to unfortunate results. The question then is, where does this new discourse come from? And what happened to produce it? And I think the answer is not that complicated. This is a symptom, in my view, of the intellectual and emotional impact of the Second Intifada. And it's one of a number of symptoms that characterize the reception of the Second Intifada. When it broke out in September of 2000, I think many people on all sides were kind of very shocked by the intensity of the violence, by the intensity of the rhetoric on both sides, by the viciousness that characterized that conflict. And it prompted people on all sides to do a negative reevaluation of what kind of peace was possible and desirable. In Israel, this was signaled by the death of the peace camp, the election of Ariel Sharon, and a radical shift to the political right, which is still playing itself out in the Netanyahu cabinet, which is dominated by people to the right of Netanyahu, which is an interesting phenomenon in the first place, to be to the right of Netanyahu. It's quite a trick to begin with. In the Palestinian territories, in the occupied territories, it was reflected in, first of all, the rise of Islamists, especially Hamas, to new levels of power, such that at the end of the Intifada, they were actually able to enter into the period we're in now, in which Hamas's not only goal, but his main goal, his defining goal, is the superseding, marginalizing, and maybe even eliminating of the PLO as the main national party in Palestine. That sort of guides their behavior at this point. It's their main ambition at present. The other thing that happened in the occupied territories, of course, was not just the rise of Islamists to this point that they can actually launch a serious, credible campaign to take over the national movement. The other effect was the rise of religious rhetoric on both sides. In the Palestinian case, certainly secular nationalists in the PLO engaged in this sort of sanctification of the struggle, use of terms like the Al-Aqsa Intifada. This is something that was introduced by Arafat, by the PLO. It was not a Hamas phrase, and it was clearly an effort not to be outbid on religious legitimacy by Islamists. So, sort of people can drag you into taking positions you otherwise might not want to take. Now, there isn't a lot of sympathy for actual Islamist policies among diasporic communities, right? And you found a very different symptom, I think, emerging of the effects of the Second Intifada, emerging in diasporic communities, especially in college campuses in the US and the UK and among grassroots activists. As I say, the people who form the diaspora, especially in the United States, are not inclined towards Islamism generally. So there might be some sympathy for Hamas as an organization, but wholehearted support for its agenda, its Muslim Brotherhood agenda, which is what it is it doesn't come easily to people. And I don't think there's a huge audience for that. It exists, but it's very limited, especially very limited on college campuses. It also, of course, since September 11, it's not only politically untenable, it's even legally risky to openly be supportive of Hamas. So the same symptoms that I think led to a rise of all these effects in Israel, negative effects in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, I think express themselves here in an embracing of this one-state idea, which is kind of very confrontational, and I think offers to some people certainly, the vision of peace and justice and equality, but I think to many other people it offers the vision of rolling back not only 67 but also 48 at the ballot box. And this is, I would argue, kind of a vainglorious vision, and it would be a risky proposition even if you could accomplish it, but more to the point, it's not accomplishable. It's not accomplishable, excuse me, for a very simple reason, which is that I have no doubt that the overwhelming majority of Jewish Israelis are not going to agree to this. I don't think you can find a formula, unlike in South Africa, where that quid pro quo of you give us power, you keep your stuff, is not available. I don't understand the quid pro quo that would convince Jewish Israelis to, in effect, dissolve their state. I don't understand where the leverage would come from. Boycotts are certainly not going to do it. I don't see any means of accomplishing it. The one-state idea belongs to this category of so-called solutions to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that really don't deserve, that name, because they don't meet the minimum national requirements of one or more of the parties that would have to agree to it. There is a version of this very common on the Israeli right. In Yediot Aharonot, day before yesterday, there was an op-ed, the subtitle of which was, Israel should transfer political responsibility for the Palestinians to Jordan. Okay, great. I should win the lottery. All kinds of things should happen. Obviously, this is a joke, because not only would the Palestinians not accept this, the Jordanians would never do it. It would be an existential threat to them. The corollary is, foist Gaza onto the Egyptians. And this sort of political wet dream of the Israeli right is that you can force the Egyptians to take over Gaza, force the Jordanians to take over parts of the West Bank that Israel doesn't want to keep. Israel can annex whatever it does want to keep, and they never have to make a deal with these horrible Palestinians. They can just do what they want, and whatever is inconvenient, they just foist it on their neighbors. No problem, right? Well, April Fool. Look at the extent that the Egyptians are going through, the political costs they're incurring, the drubbing in public opinion, the money they're spending to stay out of Gaza. This wall they're building underground. Everything they've done since the Gaza war is a desperate effort to not get sucked into Gaza. It's an existential matter. I don't think there's a more profound item on the Egyptian national security agenda than not getting sucked back into Gaza. So there's no way they would agree to this, and the Jordanians even less likely to agree to it. So it's not an idea. Like this idea of convincing the Israelis to dissolve their state, it is an excuse for not having an idea. It's a placeholder. It's not an idea, it's the box that the idea came in. And you open it up and look inside, and you find it's empty and you've been ripped off. Because one of the parties or more is not going to go along with it. And unless you can compel them to agree through some kind of means, and Frankly, compulsion of this level usually can only be acquired through military compulsion. I can't really think of another scenario, and I don't know where the one-state tank battalions are that are going to accomplish it. It has to be done by agreement, and there are some things you won't be able to get people to agree to, and I think this is clearly one of them. Now, I'm not going to go through all the arguments. This is 150 pages of dense argumentation. It's pure argumentation. There's very little description and little historical analysis in it. There's a lot of pure argumentation in it, and I'm not going to take you through the whole thing, but I will tell you, sort of sum up my arguments with a series of 6 questions that I've posed to proponents of this idea, which I don't think they've answered, and I don't think many of their supporters have considered. The first is the most obvious. If Israel cannot be compelled or convinced to end the occupation, what makes anyone think that it possibly can be compelled or convinced to dissolve itself? This is a very obvious question, but you don't really hear it dealt with. In other words, let me put it to you another way. If Israel can't be compelled or convinced to surrender or share control of 22% of the territory it controls, how are they possibly going to be compelled to share or surrender control of 100% of it? Because that's basically what this argument holds. It holds that you can't end the occupation, so you will eliminate Israel as an alternative. I'm sorry, I'm left wondering where, how that logic can possibly be addressed, and I haven't heard any credible effort to answer it. Second question, what as a practical matter does this vision of a single democratic state offer to Jewish Israelis? Now this is important because they're going to have to agree to this, right? It's going to have to be voluntary, unless, as I said, there's some secret armies that I don't know about. And I haven't heard any explanation of what's in it for Jewish Israelis other than appeals to justice and things like that. Well, of course, everyone has their own version of justice. Right? Justice can mean many different things. So those arguments don't work. You have to explain to people what's in it for them. Well, I haven't heard any effort to do it. Third, what efforts have these advocates made in reaching out to mainstream Jews and Israelis and incorporating their national narrative into this vision? In other words, it's going to be binational or post-national. It's going to have to speak to that narrative. But it doesn't. As far as I can tell, especially the Arab and Palestinian version of this, what you get is the Palestinian narrative, and that too a very strident one, one of the more strident versions. And most of its formulations are antithetical to the Jewish-Israeli narrative. Now, that's fine if you're operating in the abstract. But if you have a political agenda that perforce requires you, for any success, to convince these people, and you pay no attention to their narrative, is this even politics as such? I don't know. I don't know what it is. Fourth, how do one-state advocates propose to supersede or transcend Palestinian national identity and ambitions? It could be done. You could probably convince most Palestinians, if they thought it was possible to get this, to support it. First, because it's going to be much preferable to the occupation, at least in theory, and because they might hope to exercise power through the ballot box, and they may have a shot at it or not. I'm not sure. I think there's a lot more than demographics that contribute to power, even in countries that are relatively equitable. But the corollary is more important. Why is it that no significant Palestinian political party or faction has adopted this goal? None, right? There is an argument among Palestinians in Palestine. It's a bitter argument. It's a real argument. It's between nationalists and Islamists. This argument isn't part of it. It exists here. There, it's two competing visions, and this isn't part of the mix. It is raised from time to time. I have a whole chapter in the book. It's raised from time to time by politicians and noteworthy people in the West Bank as a threat. Right? They'll say to the Israelis, if you don't do thus and such, if you don't end the occupation, we will be forced to adopt this strategy. But it's always one step removed. It's always somebody else thinks this, or I may think this if you don't, or I will do this. It's never I am doing it now. It's never embracing this as a good idea. It's a threat, and I suspect that it has diminishing returns and probably greater costs than benefits to Palestinians who say it, because I think it plays into the hands of the Israeli right very dramatically. I think it's good for Israelis to hear this from people like Olmert, and I think it's very good that someone like Barak gets up at Herzliya, as he did last week, and says to the Israelis, if we're not careful, we will become an apartheid state, which I think is a politically acceptable way in Israel of saying, folks, we are an apartheid state. And it's good that they hear that. But I think if they hear from Palestinians, well, no, we're not happy with an end to the occupation. We want a single state for everybody in which we'll be a majority and will treat you kindly. This plays into all kinds of fears, and it positions the Israeli right to argue that the occupation is a legitimate defensive posture, and that the settlements are a legitimate defensive posture because, again, Palestinian nationalism becomes antithetical to all forms of Zionism, and you're back in this zero-sum situation. And the question then is, who has the power to enforce their vision, right? I think people need to think very carefully about that part. By the way, I don't deal in my book with the small group of Israeli and Jewish American proponents of this because it's a very different discourse, really. It seems similar, but if you unpack it, it's really quite different in many cases. Meron Benvenisti is probably the Israeli most closely associated with this idea, at least for the longest period of time. Maybe Ilan Pappé is more active. But Benvenisti has been saying this kind of thing for a long time, and even in the 80s kind of hinting at it. And what I think the Arab and Palestinian proponents of this idea miss when they listen to Benvenisti is that what he's saying, if you read him carefully, is that what we have now is a binational reality. He's right. Of course he's right. Since 1967, Israel has administered the occupied territories as if it were a part of Israel. They treat it as if it were a part of Israel, and the Palestinians as if they were not a part of Israel. So he's absolutely right about this. But what he's saying is, this is what it looks like. This, what we have now, is actually what it looks like. So if you're happy with that, you have your binational reality. There's no obvious means of reforming it, transforming it into something more equitable. I don't see, boycott is not going to do it. And I think the reality of what Benvenisti is describing actually is an argument very much against this version of the one-state solution, because that's what we have, and it's hideous. It's horrible, and actually it is evil in the way that it operates, right? So I really think this is a very serious problem. So by the way, Benvenisti came to the first and only, so far, one-state agenda conference in the United States. I'm sure there'll be many more in universities. That was held here in Boston, well, in Boston, at UMass Boston. And when he went back to Israel, he wrote a really interesting article in Haaretz in which he said, you know, I went to this thing and I found my arguments being used by a bunch of people just to bash Israel and to bash our narrative and to spew hatred at us. And I think it's very unfortunate to see your sensible arguments used this way by people who are unreasonable, but that's the lot of visionaries all over the world. So even that connection cannot be made. Right? So I think that's very important. The fifth question that I have is how, apart from empty slogans about largely non-existent and highly implausible boycotts, there's a lot of stuff talked about boycotts, but I find it difficult to imagine them really becoming very thoroughgoing. I don't see the space for them. For instance, in the United States, Israel is not going to be boycotted in any time in the foreseeable future by major American institutions. It's not going to be. I can know this country well enough to tell you that's not plausible. And if it did, it's not going to bring Israel to its knees. There's this notion behind this idea that Israel is a very fragile state, that it's a house of cards. All you have to do is blow on it, and it will fall apart, that it will collapse anyway under the weight of its own contradictions. I've had people, some of these folks who are some of my best friends for many years, tell me, yeah, I give Israel 10 years, and that was 10 years ago. Yeah, they're done for. Sharon is the last Jewish prime minister of Israel. Then comes Olmert, then comes Netanyahu again. And somebody you say, well, don't you think that was a little delusional? No, we can listen. There's no problem. I think there's a delusional sense of how fragile and transient Israel is, because it must be fragile and transient from this point of view, and it has to be, because otherwise it's a reality you have to deal with. And that's really problematic if you don't want to. So back to this question, what practical steps do the one-state advocates imagine? And what is their roadmap for success? Apart from boycott and condemnation and rhetoric, I don't see it. And I doubt boycotts will emerge on a wide basis. And if they do, they won't achieve this result. All right, there's been a boycott, a very powerful boycott, against Palestinians for the entire last 60 years. And it's still in place. There are many areas in which Palestine and Palestinians are boycotted. It hasn't made a dent in Palestinian nationalism. It's reinforced it. It's reinforced it. This denial of Palestine, denial of the Palestinian identity. There's no such thing as Palestinians. That reinforces, of course, Palestinian identity. It may bite, it may hurt, it may cost you money. It's not going to bring you to your knees. It's not going to kill a national movement. No way. No way. And the notion that boycotts were one of the most crucial factors in bringing about an end to apartheid, it's bunk. It's junk history. It's not true. It's garbage. Yeah, it's just ridiculous. They were a useful factor. But that was a war. Yeah? That was a war. Don't take away from Joe Slovo and Umkhonto Sizwe. They fought a war against apartheid with guns and bombs and car bombs and all that stuff. Yeah? There's not boycotts in the United States. Right? It's a major political military assault on that system that brought it down. Not soft measures. As we imagine, people say, oh, that's extraordinary. People say Mandela liberated South Africa without a shot being fired. Yeah, I hear it all the time. It's a joke. You know, it's one of the dumber myths. I run into it all the time. He was a great leader, but he didn't do that. The sixth question is, since they reject both Palestinian independence and the ongoing state and institution building agenda that the PA is doing at the moment, and trying to build things and build the framework of an independent state, what do one-state advocates and one-state advocacy as an agenda, what does it offer for people living under occupation other than expressions of solidarity and interminable decades of continued struggle and suffering? Right? Is that not the practical outcome of this as a practical matter? And I thought, when I posed these questions, there was likely to take some time for some kind of a response. And, I waited and whatnot. And the Jewish Americans and others who were engaged in this discourse immediately got involved in it. Oh, yeah, they hate it, they like it, they critiqued it, they said it was great, they said it sucked, they said it was ridiculous, they said it was wonderful. There a huge range of opinions coming out of the Jewish blogosphere and Jewish media. From the Arab one-state advocates, nothing. Not a word. Not a single word. They do not acknowledge its existence. They have not answered it. They have not critiqued it. They have not condemned it. They have not praised it. They just say nothing. It doesn't exist. This doesn't exist. Now, as I said, these guys are supporters of boycotts. And I think that's been extended to the book. And some of these formulations is that Israel is not referred to by name. It's referred to as the temporary racist usurping entity. And so I've nicknamed this the temporary racist usurping book, because it also must not be mentioned or dealt with in any way. But look, I understand the tactic, right? They try to diffuse something by killing the controversy by not responding to it, right? Also, if you don't have good arguments, and I think it's the case that I've thought about their position much more deeply than they have. I could make their case much better than they do. I assure you. I mean, really, I could do like at least 5 times better than any of them have in making the argument, yeah? Then I think it's very difficult to debate someone who understands your own position better than you do. So I'm sympathetic to the reticence as well. But I think there's no way to interpret this without acknowledging that it's fundamentally an expression of weakness. If these people felt in a position of strength against some of these questioned critiques that I've made, I think they'd come at me with hammer and tongs to demonstrate how ridiculous my passé, outmoded, stupid, collaborationist, traitorous arguments are. But no, nothing. I find that extremely interesting. Now, I think that everyone who says that there needs to be found an alternative solution other than ending the occupation and creating a Palestinian state has a specific burden. They have to tell you exactly what they want and how they propose to achieve it. as I said, if it's not acceptable to one of the sides, and there's no way to make it acceptable to one of the parties, then it's not a solution, and we needn't bother with it as anything serious. It can be, it can be an academic exercise, a flight of fancy, a rhetorical, a piece of demagoguery to get applause. It can be many things, but it is not a political agenda, right? Because it's not connected with anything real. Similarly, I think people on the Israeli right who kind of are in favor of the status quo, in favor of settlement activity, in favor of all these things, need to be confronted too, saying, what is your vision? Where are these damn settlements going to get you? What do you think the future of Israel is going to be without a peace agreement? Now, my argument is based on this, not simply assertion, but I think obvious fact, that it's not as if the Israelis and the Palestinians have a whole range of interesting options from which to choose from. I think there's a very simple and stark binary facing everyone, especially the parties, which is either we can have a two-state agreement and an end to the occupation, which I think, while very difficult to get, would actually work. It would end the conflict. A lot of people on both sides skeptical, would it end the conflict? I'm sure that it would for many reasons. If you want to know what they are, ask me, but I think it's kind of obvious that it would, frankly. Hold on. I've been talking all afternoon. This is not my first lecture. The people on the... I've lost my train of thought. Right. Anyway, sorry? Yes, that's right. Thank you. This is what happens when your brain starts shutting down after talking straight for 6 hours. It's not as if there's this large range of options. Yeah, I think the binary is pretty simple. The choices are pretty stark. Either we have this agreement, which would end the conflict, as I say, or what we're likely to get from the status quo and any kind of tinkered arrangement with the status quo, like Netanyahu's ridiculous idea of economic peace, is continued conflict. And we know where the conflict is going, right? We don't have to sit back and imagine the evolution of the conflict. There's a model in place that tells us where it's going, right? We kind of know where it's going. Compare the end of the first intifada with the beginning of the first intifada. Then compare the second intifada with the end of the first intifada. The pattern is logical, predictable, crystal clear. At every stage of renewed sectarian conflict in occupied Palestine, in the occupied territories, there is another level of politicization of the struggle, another level of militarization of the struggle, another level of brutalization of the struggle on both sides, and another level of religious zealotry. I don't see any way of reversing this pattern. The forces of the religious right are there in both places, ready to lead the battle for holy sites and the will of God. The sanctification of this is very dangerous, and it's very palpable. I think a lot of people are aware of the rise of the Islamist movement among Palestinians and others in the Arab world. I don't think a lot of people are aware of the equally damaging, equally dramatic rise of the religious right in Israel. And look at the behavior and rhetoric of the military rabbis during the Gaza war. This is a holy war against the Goyim who are interfering with the redemption of the Promised Land. That was the senior-most rabbi in the Israeli military. He's been replaced now by someone less cuckoo. But I mean, this is vicious stuff. And not terribly marginal rabbi in the settler movement, actually an influential one. He's just written a book which includes a section on the moral virtues of killing Gentile children in a condition of war. Babies, in fact, he said. Now, and there are obviously plenty of that on the Islamist right as well. And I don't think there's any doubt that this conflict is moving in that direction. If it's not stopped, it's going to continue moving in that direction. There isn't any other logic in place. I think a lot of people who imagine another intifada in the cast of the first intifada, the beginning of the first intifada, Gramscian, decentralized, largely nonviolent or symbolically violent with stones, grassroots, all this stuff, is impossible. Because it happened that way, because it was spontaneous, and there were not large, heavily armed political parties in competition with each other in Palestine at the time. But by the end of the first intifada, there were. Right? The PLO had come back from Tunis into Palestine with arms. The Muslim Brotherhood formed Hamas precisely because of the existence of the first Intifada. In other words, political movements saw the momentum that was created by the spontaneous public outcry and found the opportunity to harness it to their own political ends. That's not the only way to go back to that would be to eliminate those political parties, eliminate their presence on the ground, not only as armed forces, but as political structures. And that's not going to happen, right? Especially not when they're in competition with each other. So let's imagine this scenario. Let's say there are some nonviolent protests, wide scale, and the occupation forces react as they will violently. They will. I mean, there's no nonviolence of an occupying army. They can't do it. The occupation will fall apart if they do that. So they'll respond violently, and there'll be outrage. And immediately, even the most diffident of political groups and militias will find themselves presented on a silver platter with momentum they can immediately take up, counterattack, and now you have a war. I don't think that process would take more than 3 days. If it went a week, it would be a miracle. There's no way it would go longer than a week. It's quite out of the question, especially when you have groups in competition for power, which is exactly what you have in the occupied territories between Hamas and the PLO, rather. So that basically, I think, sums up my insistence that responsible parties should continue to push for an end to the occupation as the solution to this conflict. Because I don't think there's any other way of getting to a solution. Now, very reasonable. I'll ask the first question myself, even though I'm not ending right now, but I'm still going to ask the first, which is, but don't you see the almost unsurmountable obstacles to ending the occupation? Don't you recognize the extreme difficulty, the great unlikelihood of achieving a two-state agreement? Can't you see that? Yes, of course I can. I see it clearly. And it's been very well explained by many people, including Benveniste and many of the one-state advocates who invariably begin by saying the occupation cannot be reversed. It's a fact, they say, and it's not debatable. They say absolutely not, so we have to look for another alternative. Fine. I don't agree with that, but I do think it's going to be exceptionally difficult. These are long odds. I'm not optimistic. I always tell people I am not now, nor have I ever been, a member of the optimist party. I am not. I just think we don't have any other responsible option, because I think the alternative is continued occupation and continued conflict leading to religious war. There's something worth noting, which is people like to think of this conflict as a stable one in which the terms of reference have been more or less the same for 60 or 100 years. It is not. It is not that at all. It's a dynamic conflict that's always evolving, and certainly has had at least 4 separate, distinct phases over the past 100 years. The first phase, from the first Zionist Congress in Bâle to the beginning of the mandate, was a kind of prelude, a conversation between the Zionist movement in Europe and various European powers to see who would be their partner and patron. Right? Britain won. I don't know if that's a prize worth having, but they won. The second phase, between the mandate, between 22 and 48, is kind of an imperial triangle. Jewish settlers, Palestinians, British, shifting. And that had a very different set of terms of reference. After 48, between 48 and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, the Camp David Treaty, you have the Arab-Israeli conflict proper, defined almost entirely by conflict between Israel and the surrounding Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. Right? For most of that period, the Palestinians did not play any role in this. Right? Until 64, there were no revivified Palestinian organizations, right? None, not to speak of, not politically. And even after the reformation of the PLO and it started to gain ground in the 60s, I think you can still argue that it was a long time before the PLO was able to wrest Palestinian decision-making away from the dominance of the Arab states. And I think throughout that whole period, the Arab states dominated this on the Arab side. So that was, again, very different terms of reference in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Since the peace treaty between Israel and Egypt took the states out of the equation directly, it's been the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Another beast again, an ethno-national conflict for land and power between the river and the sea. New terms of reference. I think we have a fifth stage gestating right now before our eyes, an incredibly dangerous one, that could well be born sometime in the foreseeable future, a religio-apocalyptic phase. Because as I've said, feel free to challenge me on that. If you don't think so, that's fine. I see the religious right on both sides ready to take this to another level. And I see the sanctification of the conflict leading to a situation where the national movements on both sides become increasingly religious. And I think that it's that the PLO leadership and the PA leadership have bet everything on this negotiated agreement. And they've doubled down and they've tripled down. They have nothing else. If it doesn't pan out over the next decade or so, I think it's going to be very hard for them to survive. And I think we know what the alternative is because it's sitting right there. It's the Islamists. It's Hamas, undoubtedly. I think that if the Palestinian struggle becomes an Islamist struggle, and if Israeli identity becomes increasingly defined by these extremist rabbis, as I think it will in parallel, the whole thing has gone in parallel from the beginning, then I think it's going to be an unenviable situation for both parties. And Israel is going to end up facing, I think, forces and powers and realities with which it cannot deal and cannot control, and which it can't even conceptualize, actually. I think there are forces at work out there that may come to bear as a consequence of not doing a peace treaty that Israel doesn't anticipate at all, that have to do with the Muslim world in general. And I think if the Palestinian movement becomes largely defined Islamically, the Palestinian cause dies away, replaced by a conflict pitting the Muslims against the Jews over holy places and the will of God. And I wouldn't want to be part of either of those societies because it is extraordinarily dangerous. Both parties are in a position to exact enormous harm on each other over the coming decades. And the only way out, it seems to me, is through this peace treaty. Now, although I'm not optimistic, I am not hopeless either. I think there is a basis for hope that this peace treaty, this agreement, can be resurrected, even though it looks grim now. And the reason I think so, well, first of all, I take issue with the notion that the metric by which you should judge the viability of a potential two-state agreement is a critical mass of infrastructural and administrative changes imposed by Israel on the occupied territories. In other words, the settlements, the wall, the roads, the laws, the behavior of the army, etc. I think that's the wrong metric. I understand why people are looking at it because they're trying to think, okay, where would we draw the border? And if you take everything that exists now as an irreversible fait accompli and it defines all of reality, you're right. But I don't think it is. Because I think, well, first of all, I think the proper metric would be when politically a majority of people on both sides think it's not desirable anymore. At that point, it really probably does become impossible, and we have to start thinking seriously about alternatives. We're not at that point. We're not near that point. Both peoples are very solidly in favor of this. They also don't think it'll happen, and they also don't believe the other side when they say it. But they both want it. Now, if both people want it, it can be accomplished. Why? Because all those facts in the occupied territories are acts of political will. They're all reversible. And I don't say they all have to be reversed. Obviously, a land swap is part of all conventional thinking, and I think it's inevitable that there'd have to be one. And the PLO hasn't objected to that idea. They've embraced that idea within, the question is what part, and that has to be negotiated, obviously. But clearly, where walls have been put up as an act of political will, they can be taken down as an act of political will. Where settlers have been brought in, settlers can be removed. And indeed, they have been removed from Gaza, from the northern West Bank. The Rubicon is crossed on this. Now, true, you could say, well, it was so painful and it was such a small group and all, it doesn't really prove anything. But I think it does. I think it proves that, exactly, settlers can be brought in and settlers can be taken out if necessary. The Palestinian position, by the way, at the moment is that settlers could stay. But it's a position they can take freely because I think they know that no Israeli government is going to leave Jewish Israelis in a sovereign Palestinian state, especially not guys like the kind of people you find in Kiryat Arba, who will definitely have problems with their neighbors immediately, and then putting the Israeli government in an untenable situation. So I think if there is a deal like this, there will be an evacuation of settlements, and it will be an Israeli demand and not a Palestinian one. But to go back to the fundamental reality, I think plainly this is an existential requirement. It's more than a strategic necessity for both Israel and the Palestinians. Neither of them, I think, can survive happily in the long run without this. And I think it's kind of obvious, frankly. Israel cannot achieve its fundamental aim of peace and security without an agreement with the Palestinians. The Palestinians cannot achieve their fundamental aim of ending the occupation of peace and freedom without an agreement with the Israelis. There isn't going to be a military victory. If there were, it would have happened already. There really aren't any other options for securing these goals. So it remains, therefore, something that people aspire to. If it remains something that people aspire to, it's possible to accomplish it. When they give up on that aspiration, and the political will doesn't exist at all for doing any of the things necessary to get, then we have to think about alternatives. Let me say this. I think the one state, there is no such thing as a one-state solution, as I'll explain now, which is why I use the word one-state agenda. There is such a thing as a one-state outcome. And by which I mean, you can certainly imagine a scenario in which a peace treaty is not signed, the conflict goes the way I've explained I think it will, the whole thing is so painful and awful, both sides mutually exhausted, depleted after decades of brutality and decimation, that they both kind of, in mutual exhaustion, give up on their national projects and kind of merge together just to get the whole damn thing over with. It's possible to imagine that. But I think you have to be honest about what kind of process would have to occur to get you there. Look at the past 60 years. Look at all the violence and bloodshed. Hasn't really dented the national sentiments of either party. So now extrapolate from that and try to imagine what would be required to not only to dent, but to collapse those national sentiments. I find this imaginable and horrifying, absolutely horrifying. What would be required to achieve the one-state outcome would be bloodletting on a huge scale. I mean, to really literally to dwarf anything that we've seen. And worse, there are many other outcomes that are much more likely results of the scenario that might conceivably lead to a one-state outcome. So it would have to be, I mean, anyone who's sanguine about this kind of thing, I think, is being highly irresponsible. One final thing. There is another reason to, I think, not give up on this idea entirely, even though diplomacy is certainly deadlocked, and there's not going to be any breakthrough with two weak leaderships that are galactically divided, and an Obama administration that has demonstrated a lot of energy and concern but no understanding of the political dynamics within Israeli or Palestinian societies, and have made terrible mistakes because of misunderstanding Israeli politics and totally, utterly misunderstanding Palestinian politics. Nonetheless, there's something out there that's real, that's serious, and that could have potentially a transformative effect. And it's the program that was put in place by the 13th Palestinian government in in August. It is the state and institution building program of the PA. The idea is that the PA is going to go ahead and unilaterally try to create the framework, the infrastructural, the economic, the administrative, and the institutional framework of a Palestinian state in spite of the occupation, as far as possible, as much as they can do. They're going to do it unilaterally, without apology, without asking Israel's permission. Of course, it's going to require major support from the outside world, financial aid, technical aid, and American protection. It's got to be based. If not, I'm sure the Israelis will strangle it in its crib, or I think there's a good chance they would anyway. What's interesting is not only that it's actually starting to happen in the occupied, in the West Bank, not in the occupied, in the West Bank. It's starting to happen. The nucleus of a central bank is there. Community development programs, more than 1,000 completed. New security forces restored law and order in Jenin and Nablus, leading to a minor economic boomlet of, it's retail, but it's still better than nothing. And other measures that are really starting to lead in this direction. First, planned Palestinian city, Rabawi. It's another thing. Now I think what really is striking is the extent to which the Prime Minister, Salam Fayyad, has placed himself at the epicenter of what may become, is looking like and may become a transformation of the Palestinian national movement, at least in the West Bank, away from being a revolutionary and political and diplomatic organization to being an institution that governs, right? That governs on the ground. Those are very different things. And it's something the Israelis have been telling the Palestinians, well, you don't do that, which is why we don't have any confidence in you, and why don't you do this, and why don't you do that? And I think it was easy to say it to Arafat, because they knew he wasn't about that kind of stuff. And I think it was pretty easy to say it to Abu Mazen, because he personally isn't oriented that way either. I don't think you can say it to Salam Fayyad, because he can say, well, I am doing it with or without your approval, and I'm doing it with an eye to ending the occupation. I'm doing it without apology. What he's basically doing is accepting the responsibilities of self-government while continuing to insist on the right of self-determination. It puts the Israeli position in a very awkward state because it calls their bluff. You say you're committed to a Palestinian state, right? We're doing this non-violently, constructively, with international support. Everyone backs us on this. You don't say no to it. If you block it, it means you never wanted it. You have to ask yourselves, were you lying to yourselves and to everybody else when you said you wanted it? Last week, Fayyad went to the Herzliya conference, a big security conference in Israel. It's the annual confab of the political and national security elite in Israel. And he thought he was going to a panel discussion, so he arrived without a text. And he got up there and he said, I don't have a text, I really don't. And he gave an extempore speech of about 35 minutes long that was a systematic, logical explanation, point by point, of the logic behind his policies. Right? One point following logically upon the next, leading to an outcome that is peace. That is a real peace agreement and a Palestinian state that not only exists, but that actually functions and performs the tasks that it's supposed to perform, and will not become a Somalia or a Yemen or an Afghanistan in the West Bank and in Gaza. And he said this, it was a very firm speech. He didn't compromise on any crucial Palestinian principles. And the Israelis there applauded. They applauded. And it was very interesting reading the Hebrew press in the days after that, because really veteran and by no means liberal commentators, Alex Fishman in Yediot, Ben Kapsit in Yediot, and Dov Weissglass, Sharon's former advisor, in Ma'ariv, all wrote articles to the effect of, holy crap, this guy means it, he's serious, he's doing it. And you can tell from their articles that the mainstream Israeli establishment, through a journalistic kind of doppelgangers, doesn't know quite what to make of this. I mean, they're kind of excited, but they're kind of scared. They're kind of fascinated, and they're kind of appalled. They're kind of thrilled, and they're kind of panicked. They don't quite know if this is a breakthrough that they've been yearning for or a calamity that they've been hoping would never happen. And it really begs the question to them, is the occupation ever going to end or not? It's a question that until now they never really had to confront exactly in this way. Now they really do. And I think, frankly, is the best idea anybody's had, whether on the Palestinian side or anywhere else, for at least 15 years on the conflict, whether it succeeds or not. And I think we have to find a way of making it work. And that's what I say about this agenda of ending the occupation. Yes, it's unlikely. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, it's easy to explain the 1,001 reasons why it can't be done. But I think we have to make it work, because we can make it work, as opposed to all these other fanciful ideas like the Egyptian-Jordan thing or the one-state thing. That we definitely cannot make it work. And we have to make it work because the alternative is extremely gruesome and bad for everybody. And I think the present PA cabinet has given us a really interesting way of working towards it, even if diplomacy is stalled to some extent. Adding a bottom-up institution-building agenda that complements and kind of protects, in a way, the top-down diplomatic agenda, and that has real immediate political consequences. And if it's sustained over a period of time, with Western support and political protection, can be transformative and change entirely the landscape in which this peace is being negotiated, in which the whole thing is taken. You could think of it as the Palestinian answer to settlement building. And it is actually that. Thank you.